Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this fourth webinar in our Spotlight series. Today, the focus is all around food security and disaster risk reduction. I'm Katelyn Samson. I'm the Deputy Director of Resilience and Risk Reduction across the partnership of AIDR and AFAC, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this session today. I'll start today by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the way thousands of generations of Indigenous people as original systems thinkers have lived with natural hazards, and acknowledge that there is so much that we can learn from that accumulated wisdom as we face increasing challenges. Before I introduce our speakers today, I have just a few brief housekeeping notes to share with you. Firstly, just to note that our event today will be recorded and the AIDA team will make that available along with the presentation slides after this event. We'll be using the Q&A feature in Zoom to take questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat window. You'll be able to upvote the questions that you like the sound of or like the look of by using the thumbs up button. And I'll do my best to ask as many of those questions as possible to our speakers after their sessions, at the end of their presentations. And I also encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections or links that you may have that are relevant during the presentations. And just a reminder that you'll need to select everyone in the drop-down menu so that everyone can see the messages that you post. And of course, a reminder to please be respectful to each other and to our presenters when you're posting your comments and questions. And finally, just a little bit of a trigger warning. Some of the content that we discuss today might be distressing, or it might bring up some prior experiences that some of you have had. So we really encourage you to draw on those techniques that you have developed, that may help you manage some adverse reactions. So as you listen to our presenters today, we really invite you to consider and to think critically about what this content really means for you, how you could apply some of these learnings to your role and to the range of communities that are part of your everyday lives. And, if there's one particular action that really stands out, what's that action that you really feel inspired to take? So we would really love you to put your thinking caps on and see how you can apply this material to your everyday roles and your everyday lives. So on to our topic today of food security. We know that it's a critical, but it's an often underexplored dimension of disaster risk reduction. It's shaped not only by supply chains, but also a whole range of social, economic and community systems that influence people's access to safe, nutritious food. And in our webinar today, we'll explore how disasters affect food security across these interconnected systems, from local community impacts through to national coordination. The webinar will consider how risks emerge and compound, particularly for vulnerable people, and how different actors work together to strengthen resilience before, during and after disasters. We'll hear from some wonderful speakers. We have Dr. Nick Rose and Mia Cox, who work with Sustain, the Australian Food Network, and they'll share their insights on community-led systems-based approaches to building more resilient and equitable food systems. And we'll also hear from Rachel Montgomery from the National Emergency Management Agency, or NEMA. And Rachel will provide an overview of the National Coordination Mechanism and its role in supporting coordinated national responses to disruptions that affect critical systems, including food. So that's enough from me for now. So please join me in welcoming our first speakers today. We have Dr. Nick Rose and Mia Cox from Sustain, the Australian Food Network. Nick is the co-founder and executive director, and Mia works alongside Nick as a senior project officer. So welcome, Nick and Mia. I'll pass the reins over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Katelyn, and hi everybody. It's really great to be with you this afternoon, and thank you very much to AIDR for this invitation to spend the next 20 minutes with you, sharing some of our work and insights on this really important topic of food security. I also just wish to acknowledge the depth of experience and wisdom that's on the webinar today, noticing that there are many people on the land, farmers and others working in all different points across government and civil society that have a depth of experience in this topic. So really looking forward to questions and discussions towards the end. If we could just move to the next slide, please. So I'm the co-founder and executive director, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Mia Cox, Senior Projects Officer. Could move to the next slide, please. Just want to begin by acknowledging that as Sustain, we work on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri or Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, respectfully acknowledging the custodianship of their people whose lands we're on today, recognising that they and their ancestors stewarded these lands and their diverse creatures sustainably for tens of thousands of years. And we pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations persons who may be with us today. Next slide, please. So this is what Mia and I will be taking you through over the next 20 minutes. I'll be speaking to the framing questions around food security, food systems, the intersection of food security and disasters, disaster resilience, and looking at what that means in terms of vulnerabilities and fragilities in our food system. And of course, that's very front of mind this year and indeed this decade with the various challenges that we've been under. And then I'll hand over to Mia, who will talk about some examples and opportunities and practical next steps. Next slide, please. So I think it's important that we actually begin by talking about what food security actually means. And this graphic is included by the Australian government, by DAF, in the development of Feeding Australia. For those who've been following that process, it will be familiar to you in the discussion paper and the various documents that DAF have put out as they've been moving through the first phase of the development of our National Food Security Strategy. And I think one of the things that's really important to note about this definition is that it is not simply about agriculture and food production. Of course, that is fundamentally important to food security, but food security is a much broader concept than that. This definition is actually the product of 50 years of experience and development by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Food Security Committee, and other experts. And it's got these 6 pillars of agency, stability, sustainability, access, availability, and utilisation, all of which are important and fundamental and must be fulfilled in order to have a lasting situation of food security, which I would hope is what we are all aspiring for in our country and indeed for the world. If we could move to the next slide, please. So from food security, broadening it out further, because food security is really the outcome, if you like, of a well-functioning, equitable and sustainable food system, which is itself a complex and multidimensional concept. As you see there, the food system, the food and farming system, includes everything that is happening from the farm, from soils, from water, through supply chains, logistics, food processing and manufacturing, to distribution networks, retail, consumption, and then to what happens with waste recovery. but it is nested within a range of intersecting political, social, and economic systems, and it has major impacts, particularly on health, on human health. Indeed, food systems in Australia and the diet that we're now consuming is one of the biggest drivers of chronic disease. But also, from an environmental perspective, food and agriculture are a major generator of anthropogenic greenhouse emissions, as well as processes of land use change, loss of habitat, loss of species. So they have the capacity to do a great deal of harm and damage, but they're also fundamental to our social, economic well-being and sustainability, and offer tremendous opportunities for positive and inspirational change. So if we can go to the next system, please. Next slide, rather. So in terms of the intersection of these, this question of food security and disaster, there are multiple ways in which this can take place. As we've seen in the first part of 2026 with the Middle East crisis, there are serious concerns about the dependence of agriculture and food systems, particularly in a large country like Australia, on fossil fuels and transport. So that's a clear potential risk and vulnerability. Climate change and extreme weather events are another big intersection between food security and the field of disaster planning and resilience. Pandemics, which of course we lived through a few years ago, and then biosecurity, which we're seeing in the news right now with the disturbing cases of bird flu in Western Australia. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So just to make those big pictures kind of concrete and real in particular cases, and two that we'd like to highlight over the last 15 years. So this one concerns the major flood events in Queensland in 2011, when there were major extreme weather events. And what was noticed, and indeed in that peer-reviewed article you see there in Agriculture and Human Values, it was found that the long food supply chains, the large distance supermarket supply chains, did experience significant challenges in actually getting food to flood-affected towns during that episode, and by contrast, more localized or shorter food supply chains, which really drew for their supply from growers in peri-urban areas and on more community based food initiatives, remained largely intact and were able to provide food at a time when the supermarkets experienced significant challenges in being able to do so. So that, I think, is a really important experience and insight when we're thinking about disaster resilience and food security. So we could go to the next slide, please. And then a decade later, we had the major flood events in northern New South Wales, in Lismore, which experienced two really large flood events in that year of 2022. The supermarkets were again largely impacted. Supermarket shelves were empty, but it was communities that were able to mobilise and organise and respond. And an insight from this example, and I know that we have somebody from Lismore who's looked at this very closely on the webinar today, Jean Renouf, that this was really a case of communities coming together, working together, and being able to respond at really short notice in a time of critical need. And again, that's a really important insight in terms of disaster preparedness and resilience and food security. If we could go to the next slide, please. So these and other examples do reveal that our food system, which in usual times seems to be very stable and well functioning, does have some critical cracks and vulnerabilities. And again, the Middle East crisis in the first part of 2026 has really brought that home into sharp relief. So we've created this table that just shows some foundational assumptions that underpin broad community thinking, and indeed in many ways policy frameworks at state and federal level in Australia. And then on the right-hand side of that table, just doing a bit of a reality check to show that those assumptions actually need a bit of a harder look and some interrogation. So there's an assumption that Australia is food secure, for example, because we produce enough food by some measures to feed 90 million people. Well, yes, that is true, but it's also true that according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and also the hunger reports that Food Bank puts out, that as many as 30% of people in Australia sit actually somewhere on the spectrum of food insecurity. We have, as has been brought home to all of us in the Middle East context, some critical vulnerabilities with important inputs, notably diesel and also fertilizers. We have amazing producers who do fantastic work in being so productive and in managing our diverse landscapes across this country. However, they are also struggling. We've got a demographic challenge with the average age of Australian farmers now pushing 60 or over 60 in many sectors. We've got concerning statistics about the mental well-being of our farmers, which at least in part is reflective of the market conditions under which they operate. From a health perspective, we've got a real challenge, as I mentioned, with ultra-processed foods now comprising over 50% of the average Australian diet. We've got a bit of a patchy welfare net in terms of the emergency food relief sector that is really struggling as more and more people are finding themselves forced to rely on it. We've got supermarkets that are losing their social license, as we've heard from the federal court recently with the cases about fake discounting strategies. And we've got governments that are really scrambling to put in place long-term planning frameworks, which is why the Feeding Australia process is so important. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is some great work that has been done by Melbourne University over the last 10 years. This is the Foodprint Melbourne research project that has been funded by the Greater Melbourne Foundation, previously the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. And what Dr. Rachel Carey and colleagues at Melbourne Uni have done through a series of reports have really looked into what a resilient food system would look like, particularly in the metropolitan context around Melbourne. And as you see there, there's a range of components to that. One of them in particular is more, as those flood examples from Queensland and Lismore illustrate, is the need for shorter supply chains, looking after our peri-urban producers, having robust logistics networks, and protecting farmland close to cities rather than simply subdividing it and pouring concrete over it and putting it all into the real estate market. Just in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next slide because I want to hand over to Mia in a minute. So I've already touched on this. It's really important that as many of us as possible engage with the federal government and its process in developing the National Food Security Strategy, Feeding Australia. We have set out in a couple of articles on the Conversation website what we feel that this strategy really needs to contain, and it needs to be underpinned, we believe, by human rights, by actually legislating the right to food as underpinning national food security. Go to the next slide, please. So what we have done as an organisation to support our members and stakeholders to engage with this process is actually conduct webinars ourselves. We've been engaging with the food security team at DAF in various opportunities. We've created a food security pulse check survey, which you can have a look at on our website. And we've created events ourselves in Launceston last December, in Melbourne last month, and we'll be having another one in Western Australia in November this year. And if we just go to the next slide, and then I'll hand over to Mia. So I just want to acknowledge the leadership and role of some important organisations in this space, particularly Vic Health and their prioritisation of sustainable and healthy food systems in their 10-year strategy. So that has been concretely expressed through a range of funding programs, notably this one, Local Partnerships for Food First, which is really supporting up to 50 to 60 organisations in place-based collaborations across various districts of Victoria in multi-year multi-stakeholder partnerships to really expand access to healthy, affordable food and to strengthen food security in those regions. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mia. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having us here today. And similar to Nick, just acknowledging the huge amount of expertise and knowledge and experiences in this webinar this afternoon. If we could just jump onto the next slide, I'm just going to talk us through a couple of further little examples and then get to some practical steps around what can be done to strengthen the resilience of community food systems at that more, I guess, at a regional, local government and then really local community level. We've been really lucky to work with a number of local governments, particularly here in Victoria, who are really taking on a key role in supporting their communities to strengthen food security and the local food system. And they're doing that in a number of ways. For example, recently we did some work with City of Greater Geelong, who have been mapping and engaging with all their different sort of local producers, community organisations, food relief organisations and actors in that food space to bring them together, understand who is who and build those relationships so that they have a really strong network, both to kind of have a proactive approach to strengthening their local food security. But I guess that's also a really great example of having those relationships ready to go so that in the case of a crisis or an emergency, people are ready to kind of connect, coordinate, and everyone knows who is who. Also, we've done quite a bit of work doing action planning or strategic planning with councils, again, to bring together different areas of, I guess, different sectors who work in food security to connect and come up with plans and strategies together. And that's been through a range of different lenses, both climate change and sustainability, health and wellbeing, economic development, community development, and that sort of community resilience frame as well. And we also have a little community of practice for local governments who are working in this space, finding creative ways to be strengthening the community food system, where we share practice and knowledge. We'll jump on to the next slide as well. And also just to give a little shout out, we are speeding through a whole number of initiatives here, but in every community, we know that there are many fantastic community-led and grassroots initiatives that are working to address food security and food resilience in different and creative ways. One example here from Victoria is the organisation Farm My School, who they're doing some really groundbreaking work working with within schools, in high schools, to train up young people to become farmers and food producers, but also using unused school land for food production and also feeding their school communities, which is a really brilliant model of, a much more resilient way of feeding a local community. And there's also brilliant examples of food shares, you know, like in small regional communities where people are sharing local produce between themselves. Examples of organisations getting together and coordinating, such as Outer East Food Share, where they're working a bit of a food relief hub that is connecting and distributing food across a whole wider region in partnership with a whole bunch of other organisations. We'll jump to the next slide because I'm just mindful of time here. So just to highlight, again, this may not be relevant for everybody because I know it's a really broad audience here today, but some practical things that we can all do to strengthen our community's food security resilience in preparation for disasters, shocks and stresses, which we don't know what they will always be, but really focusing in on the local context and thinking about what we can do with who we have and the resources we have around us. Every community is different. But some practical things you can do is that mapping of your community food assets. Those are what's already happening on the ground in your local community. That could be hyperlocal, that could be local government area, that could be regional, but really getting a sense of what your food assets are. Also things like mapping your community infrastructure, kitchens, community facilities, markets, cool storage, transport, actually knowing what those are so that when, again, if a time of crisis comes, you're kind of ready to go with pooling those resources. Really knowing what your community food needs are. Every community is different, but really having a clear sense of the dietary needs, household types, you know, what are some of those other transport challenges, the incomes of the people in your community, the skills and resources that people have to prepare food. All of this is really important information so that you can actually be prepared and be servicing your community. And then finally, I think, as I mentioned already, building those relationships and forming local food networks, which are really critical, not just critical in times where it's sort of more business as usual, but also in those emergency and I guess long recovery processes as well. And the final slide, if you just want to jump to the next slide. Oh, very quickly, we'll pop this in the chat. If you're looking for some really practical tools and resources, again, as Nick mentioned, Foodprint Melbourne has some really great tools to help communities actually do food resilience planning and preparedness. We'll jump to the next slide there. As I said, we've really skimmed through all of this, but we would love to continue the conversation if anyone is interested. Please sign up to our newsletter. We have a whole network where people who are working in food in all different kinds of ways are connecting and in dialogue, called the Australian Food Network. And yeah, if there's something that we've mentioned today that maybe ways that we could support you and your community with some of those things like mapping and planning and building your community network so you're ready both to serve your current and future community needs in terms of food security, we'd be really happy to chat about that. And as I mentioned, we've got, particularly if you're part of a local government and you'd like to sort of chat more with others who are working in this space, we'd love to chat to you more about that as well. I'll leave it there because I realise, yeah, we'll hand over to the next presenter, but thank you so much. And please reach out. Yeah, our emails will be shared after the session.
Thanks so much, Nick and Mia, for all of that inside scoop and for that intel in such a short period of time. And I really encourage, if anyone has any questions for Mia and Nick, to pop those in the Q&A as they kind of come to you. But for now, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Rachel Montgomery, to join us. Rachel is the Director of the National Coordination Mechanism Operations with the National Emergency Management Agency. Thank you so much, Rachel, and over to you for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katelyn, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm joining you from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today. So it's really interesting to follow Nick and Mia's presentation, which has given us such a comprehensive overview of the food supply situation and food security issues that we're facing in Australia. My presentation is it's about a very specific part of what they experience. So I'd like to really talk to you about what the Australian government is doing in this specific context, which is supporting the nation during emergencies and crises, which includes food supply disruptions. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce the agency NEMA for those of you who don't know or haven't come across us. So the National Emergency Management Agency, it was set up in September 2022, and it's the Australian government agency that's responsible for emergency management. So whilst the agency does we cover the entire emergency management continuum for prevention and preparedness through to response, recovery and risk reduction. The area of the agency that I work in is the emergency response side of the house. And so we're very much there for those situations where Australia are having their very worst day, often very quickly. The agency itself, it's a big role for quite a small agency. There are only about 400 staff in NEMA, but we do a huge amount of work. We often work very closely with other government agencies and as well with state and territory governments to respond. And I'd like to talk about the environment that we work within and touch upon some of what we do, and then talk about specifically the capability that my team deliver, which is the National Coordination Mechanism. So next slide, please. So you'll have heard from, like Nick particularly outlined a bit of the environment that we're looking at the moment in Australia in terms of food supply and some of the risks that are there and that get tested quite regularly. For NEMA, and particularly my area of the agency, we are looking at, we're working in what we term a new paradigm. So we're looking at what we consider to be novel crises. And we're particularly concerned about, what you can see on this graph is we're looking at what our capacity and capability to deliver is against the disaster intensity and the consequences of those disasters. And you can kind of see that as disaster intensity and consequence goes up, our ability to meet that goes down. And we are very much concerned with being able to operate in that novel crisis space where crises are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we are set up to actually work in that space. So next slide, please. So this slide shows you the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework. So I know this probably won't be relevant for a lot of people, but just so that you know, we do have this piece of work that shows how we all work together across the nation, right at the top of the strategic level in the Australian government. So on the one side, you'll see how the Australian government manages itself and its coordination. And you'll see right in the middle there, the team that I lead to help operationalise the National Coordination Mechanism. And then over on the other side, you'll see how we link in with state and territory government coordination. So the AGCMF just helps us set out the roles and responsibilities for ministers and agencies, and works out how we then work together during a crisis. And on to the next slide, please. So we have to be really careful about when we actually step in to manage a crisis. So we don't just hoe in. We actually work very, very carefully and closely with our state and territory counterparts who have their own jurisdiction to manage. So we only step in when there's actually a request by a state or territory for Australian government assistance, where the scale of the crisis and its potential impact is really big, and we can see that our help's going to be needed, where there's an incident that covers a number of jurisdictions or a number of industry sectors, where there are multiple or simultaneous crises, such as we might have a cyclone in one space, we might have bushfires somewhere else, we might have a cyber attack somewhere else, we might have a crisis, a conflict offshore that we're dealing with. So if all of that hits at once, we may step in. That includes crises where we have both domestic and international components. And we also get involved when there are community expectations of national leadership. So the AGCMF kind of really looks at all of those things and helps us set out how we're going to respond in those situations, and how we're going to work with jurisdictions to do that. So on to the next slide, please. So within NEMA, we do a huge range of things. On like what you see on the slide, there are just some of the capabilities that we use to help us deliver during a crisis. So we have something called strategic planning and engagement. So we develop plans for particular situations, which we then apply during those, if those crises occur. And they can be held by any government agency at the Australian government level. So they can be activated during particular crises. So just for example, we've got a couple of national plans that are activated. One is our community disaster plan, which is a ComDis plan that helps us provide support to jurisdictions during a crisis. And we also have our AusReset plan. We had our AusReset plan activated very recently, which helped us bring some of the travellers back who were unfortunately potentially impacted by hantavirus. We have something called the National Situation Room, which collects and maintains data, a national picture of what's happening across Australia, and briefs out to a whole heap of government agencies and keeps us updated with near real-time situational awareness of what's occurring. We have something called the National Joint Common Operating Picture, which is an online platform that is available across the Australian government and to states and territories, gives them a way of looking at what's occurring so that you can look at those complex and compounding situations where you have multiple crises happening at the same time. We have crisis coordination teams, which is a particular way of standing up a crisis response team. We have something called crisis appreciation strategic planning, which is a methodology that is used when a crisis is occurring to help us plan appropriately for response to that crisis. We do a huge amount of exercising. We do have a national exercising and lessons capability who stand up at least 2 national exercises a year that bring together whole of government. So all the states and territory, all of Australian government, local government, industry, not-for-profit sector, all invited to come and participate in a national exercise that really tests us at that VUCA level, that volatile, complex, uncertain space. We have a national preparedness program, which we run each year, and that program helps us to work with jurisdictions prior to the high risk weather season, which runs towards, from October through to March, April. And we also have the national coordination mechanism, which is what my team deliver. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I showed previously, the NCM sits at the centre of the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework, and it's usually activated to support to support coordination during near-term crisis preparedness, crisis response, and also early recovery. And it's there to support consequence management, and that's at any stage of a crisis response. So it was initially developed to do this during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what it did was it enabled the Australian government to work very flexibly and collaboratively with states and territories, as well as industry and the not-for-profit sector, and to be able to bring all of those areas together to be able to look at what problems we were facing and find solutions for it, and then work together to actually deliver a response. So it's actually quite a simple concept when you think about it, but has taken quite a bit of work to effectively deliver it. So it's really key to helping the Australian government manage the interconnectedness and interdependencies between key sectors like water, energy, telecommunications, and of course, food. It really supports shared situational awareness, helps us do that rapid problem definition, and it helps us coordinate all of the actions that people then take in response to complex crises. It's really flexible, it's scalable, so it can be used for any size of crisis and to consider any crisis topic. So we generally use it to maintain that real-time awareness. We use it to provide national leadership. So out of an NCM, you will hear messaging come out that that provides the public with some kind of confidence that government knows what it's doing and is acting together to deliver an appropriate response. It brings together, it's a combination of that government, state and territory, industry, peak bodies. We have not-for-profits and eminent people come to the table in NCMs, but we only invite organisations because of their expertise or their experience and their role in helping us to identify and implement stabilising actions during crises. So on to the next slide, please. So this, just as a very brief overview, we do organise ourselves carefully. We try to make sure that we know what we're responding to and how we're responding to it in terms of coordination. So under the AGCMF, we have 4 tiers of coordination. At tier 1, we may not be activated, but there might be an Australian government agency that's working with a particular sector or jurisdiction to respond. At tier 2, it's probable that we might be running a series of NCMs, but we will actually be working with another Australian government agency to deliver that response and help them coordinate all of their stakeholders. At tier 3, that's when it gets a little bit more complicated. We might have a number of things happening at once that we need to bring together into the NCM for people to look at sort of how we're going to respond to this interconnected and interdependent situation. And that we may have a range of agencies involved at that point. And then up into tier 4, this is where NEMA takes overall coordination management of a situation. And this is where things are catastrophic. They are really bad and you just need one point of contact for government to help them actually lead a response to it. Next slide, please. So the NCM, it is an all hazards tool, so it can be applied to anything. So it really helps NEMA to assist to stabilise in, say, the context of food supply, supply chain issues, because it can bring together the right stakeholders at the right time across government, industry and not-for-profits. What happens in NEMA is we have a crisis intelligence team who will look at all the potential issues during crisis, and they will help us to pull together who is relevant across Australian government agencies to gain data that we need to support, to inform the NCM. And then at the NCM, we'll discuss how we might want to respond, and it's the responsibility of other government agencies as well as state and territory governments to implement and manage like what might be happening, for example, in a supply chain crisis, what those issues are and what the response actually is. So you can see here we cover all sorts of things. We do natural hazard responses in response to anything from cyclones, storms, floods and fires. We work a lot with cyber colleagues to manage cyber incidents. We work with critical infrastructure, and we're at the moment activated for biosecurity, given that we have a response to the avian influenza virus. And we also support our national security colleagues for anything in that space. So on to the next slide, thank you. So I wanted to share just a little bit of our data, and this is more to show just how central food supply is to our activity. So down the left-hand side, you can see some of the key criteria that we have where we run an NCM, we do some coordination on a particular crisis. And this shows you how often, this is just since NEMA inception, so it's not since the NCM was developed, which is in March 2020, but this is just since NEMA was formed. So this is the range of responses that we have. So you can see over on the left, most of our responses are around severe weather. And then there are a range of responses that are about preparedness, where we're actually trying to inform prior to a crisis occurring. Then we've got cybersecurity and things like national security, international conflict, etc., etc. Food and critical goods supply, it's very often a second or third order consequences of all these other crises. So even though we might be focusing initially on a particular thing, we are very, very aware of all of those second and third order consequences, and that food might be one of them. So a really recent example is the national fuel situation, which was mentioned by the previous presenters. And that's due to conflict in the Middle East, which is kind of like that first instigator of a crisis. And given the many impacts that a lack of fuel has had on food production and delivery, there are many, many, many interdependent impacts sort of right across that sector. So on to the next slide. So this just, again, to highlight that, and apologies for the typo in the title of that slide, we've held 723 NCMs since we were formed in March 2020. 175 of those NCMs have been directly focused on food supply crises, so 24% of those NCMs. And then an extra 120 plus NCMs have been held for severe weather or natural hazards, so that's another 16%. So overall, NCMs are likely to consider food supply or food security issues at least 40% of the time. And that graph at the bottom just shows you from start to finish, it's a very sort of broad, like a high level outline of how many NCMs we've run and when they have occurred. So you'll see it's not necessarily regular, as you would expect with a crisis response space. So crises can happen a lot and be concentrated around very specific crises. And on to our next slide. So a little bit about the NCM. If any of you are invited along, we are a little bit unique. So we're not a typical secretariat in that delivers a usual planned sort of timed meeting. So an NCM, it can be called at any time. You'll often have little or no notice to plan or prepare. CrowdStrike's a really good example for us, because it required speed to action within 2 hours. So within 2 hours of us hearing about the need for a response, we were up and running and had about 250 people on a call across all critical infrastructure sectors to respond to that issue. We can run multiple NCMs at one time, particularly if there are consecutive, compounding and concurrent crises. So we have sub-teams that have a really flexible approach that standardizes what it can to be able to meet the needs of the crisis that we're trying to respond to. We have no terms of reference, and that helps us stay flexible, and we've got no set membership. So our invitee lists are almost always different, and all we want to make sure is that we get the right people from the right organisation in the room at the time to solve the problem. On to the next slide. So who would attend? As I said, not a committee, no standing membership, and attendance is by invitation only, and that will really vary depending on the crisis. So we might invite anybody from any of these areas, so whole of government, whole of industry, not-for-profit sector, and any expert advisors that can inform the crisis. So we want to hear from those who are impacted, those who have knowledge and experience that is relevant, and those who can help us identify and implement stabilising actions. Next slide. Thank you. So the NCM is called by one of our senior leaders, who's called the Deputy Coordinator General. So they're basically the second in charge in our agency in the crisis response space. So they work for the Emergency Management and Response Group, and they activate and chair the NCM, or they co-chair it with another agency. I think that's probably my cue to skip through my slides. I think I've got just a couple left. If I can go to the next slide, please. So what to expect in an NCM? Please, if you get a request for a contact update, if you're an agency or an organisation where we might be inviting you along, please provide us with up-to-date contact details. Expect short notice invitations, and an NCM itself, it's usually about an hour long. That's all that we need in an NCM to do all of those things to help us respond to the crisis. You'll get situational awareness, collaborative problem solving, and a coordinated response out of it. And we provide solutions management during those consecutive, concurrent and compounding crises. I think that's me. I think that's the end. Are there any questions? Very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And we've got all of our presenters back on the screen now. So we've got a few minutes now for some Q&A. We've got a couple of questions coming through, and I'm kind of starting to see a bit of a thread and a narrative to the flow of questions. So I feel like what we're hearing is that we're hearing kind of a combination of that kind of high level preparedness for crisis response in food security from Rachel. And we're hearing from Nick and Mia about those localised preparedness approaches to food security that really speak to kind of the sustainable development elements of food security. The first question here is, I think, around, how do we meet in the middle? How do we kind of bring those two approaches together to make sure that we're kind of doing something about being prepared in general. So we're not waiting for the crunch of a crisis or a disaster until, issues of food security really, hit the fan. So that's an open question, and I might kind of work through each of our speakers, and I'll start with you, Nick, to respond to that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Katelyn. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the vulnerability of the food system has really been exposed in the 2020s, and there's a real need for integrated long-term planning, which is why it was great to hear all the work being done by the NCM with Rachel and her team, and that food security and the integrity of our food system is very much front of mind for the NCM, and to have those coordination mechanisms in place is really essential. I'm going to share a link in the chat that I think will be of interest, hopefully, to everybody on the call, which is the summary of the views of dozens of experts from the United Kingdom looking at how a major food crisis could happen in the United Kingdom. They were looking at scenarios involving geopolitical conflict, and this research and this report was published just before the Middle East war broke out at the end of February this year. So they're looking at geopolitical conflict, extreme weather, and/or cyber attacks as trigger events that could really push the UK into a major crisis that could potentially result in riots and civil unrest in Britain. So they were saying, in terms of putting in place measures to really prevent and respond to that. There would need to be measures such as supporting vulnerable populations to have enough income to access food. So that's a critical thing. There need to be measures to support farmers and producers to cope with such an emergency. But also, and this is, I guess, the point that Mia and I were really making, there needs to be work done at the community level, and particularly here a role for local government working with community organisations to develop community and civil food resilience action plans and strategies as a really central underpinning to a national response to a crisis situation. And that's, I think, highlights one of the points I was trying to make with that six-dimension definition of food security, and that question of agency, which really speaks of the need for community members across Australia to have a real say and opportunity to participate in these debates and in these questions. And that was really reinforced by the views of these experts. So I'll stop there, and I'll share the link to that article in the chat.
Thanks, Nick. And Rachel, a response from you, and then I'll go to Mia quickly to add any kind of final thoughts on that topic. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for us because we work at that very strategic national level to kind of talk about how individuals in the community can actually sort of get engaged. One thing I would say is that we have a national network of coordination and planning officers who actually link in with jurisdictions to kind of help them prepare for crises. And any kind of we have training available on exercising, so how people can actually run scenarios for themselves to actually build up their capability in terms of responding, and exercises are fundamental to us maintaining our ability to respond during crises. Again, it's not really applicable down at the community level necessarily, but I guess, you know, the theory behind it could be adapted, I'm sure, to do that.
Great, thank you. And Mia, any comments just to kind of close this question out?
Yeah, I think the only final thing I'd add, which I did touch on before, but I think it's that really important point that I come from a community development background, so I'm really used to working with local communities, and I know that every community is different and unique, and so I think it's, I guess, in terms of balancing the grassroots up approach and then that sort of coordination, I would really recommend, again, if you're on the call, particularly if you're part of local government and maybe you're part of the emergency management mechanism, also to sort of think a little bit laterally before time gets to a crisis, across your local government, work with your community development team, really make sure that you have those strong networks, relationships, and a really deep understanding of who your community is, so that you can be having that, I guess, that proactive approach to trying to address food security at the local level, but that also you have those really good relationships and that deep understanding of what works for your community ready to go, so that in the time of a crisis, you're in a really good position to work well together and to respond to the unique context that you're in. Great, and that does require a bit of lateral thinking, you know, because I think sometimes I've worked in local government myself, and I know sometimes we are in our lane and we've got a lot to do, but I think also in a time of crisis and with increasing complexity that we're all dealing with, we have to be a little bit more creative and thinking a little bit more laterally as we're kind of responding.
Thanks, Mia. So picking up on that thread, I really picked up a comment that Nick made right at the start of the presentations, where he said something along the lines of, sorry, Nick, I'm not going to quote you, but something along the lines of, a focus on food security really provides opportunities for positive and inspirational change. And we've got a question here from someone who works with First Nations communities, and they're asking really about how can we apply some of this thinking and that lateral thinking to traditional food security in this space? Do you have any examples or any thoughts or ideas or recommendations on what they can do to kind of get some traction in that space?
I'll jump in, and others might want to add. But thanks, thank you very much for that question. I did reply to Lisa as well and shared a couple of links. I mean, we have got the National Food Security Strategy for remote Aboriginal communities, which has already been developed by the federal government. We've also got some great work that has been done by VATSHO, and I also shared this link with Lisa, and I'll put both these links in the chat as well. But they worked with researchers at Deakin University a couple of years ago now, and they're describing the report, Food Path, it's called, Community Empowerment, the Key to Food Security. That was the result of many community workshops conducted in 2022 with VATSHO and various ACOs in the Central Victoria Shepparton region. So very much foregrounding community self-determination, food growing initiatives, community gardens, workshops and yarning circles with elders to educate the community about traditional foods, community-based parenting programs, and early years programs around healthy eating and pregnancy and early childhood, as well as some clear recommendations to government, such as banning junk food marketing, mandating nutrition and cooking education in schools, and related initiatives. So that's one example, I think, of First Nations leadership. And I know Vic Health are also doing some important work with different First Nations communities across Victoria on these topics.
Thank you, Nick. And unfortunately, this always happens. We have so many wonderful questions and such limited time. So I'm going to have to bring our Q&A to a close, but this is really just the trigger for people to kind of think critically about this issue further and reach out to you if they have any further questions, and please also through us. So I'd love to thank our presenters again. Dr. Nick Rose, Mia Cox and Rachel Montgomery for speaking with us today about this critical issue. And just a reminder that as you leave today to really, think about, what is one thing or one tip that you can take away from this session today and how you can apply that within the communities that you live, work and play with. I'd like to thank my AIDR colleagues for their work in making our webinar possible. And just a note that our next AIDR webinar will be a special webinar during NAIDOC week, where we'll have Dr. Bayami Williamson presenting us on the critical issue of Indigenous leadership in disaster resilience. That will be the 7th of July from 1 to 2 p.m. And you'll find that registration link on the screen now. And just when you leave this call, you'll be taken to a short survey. And we'd love to hear about what your needs are and to learn about our professional development events a little bit further. So on behalf of AIDR, thank you so much for joining us and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.